May 1943, Atlantic Ocean. Peter-Erich Cremer laughs when his radio man suggests they stay submerged. The wolf packs own the night. 3 years of hunting convoys on the surface, sending 20-second reports and vanishing before anyone gets a bearing. The old British loop antennas need a full minute to triangulate. Cremer's message takes 19 seconds. He stands on U-333's bridge, collar up against the spray, diesel exhaust bitter in his throat, watching a horizon that should stay empty. His radio man taps out 25 characters. 19 seconds. Then the sky splits open. Avenger bombers appear overhead, not in an hour, not in 30 minutes, but before the transmission even finishes cooling in the air. Cremer hears the engines first, sliding down through the steel hull. He screams to dive. The conning tower dips, hatches spin, red emergency lights flood the interior. The boat groans as the ocean presses warm and heavy on their ears. The first depth charge pattern falls close enough that water slaps the hull. Someone laughs it off. They were only on the air for 19 seconds. Then another pattern falls closer. What Cremer doesn't know, those 19 seconds aren't invisibility. They're a searchlight. 4 metal antennas and a green HF-DF screen have turned his advantage into a death sentence. Within weeks, 40 U-boats sink, a quarter of Germany's submarine fleet erased in a single month. The hunters become the hunted, and the weapon isn't a bomb. It's a receiver that hears everything. For years, the wolf packs hunted at night while surfaced, scattering convoys and slipping away into darkness. Short signals, Kerr's signale, were the answer. Compress a full report into seconds, beat the old loop antenna direction finders that took a full minute just to get a bearing. It worked brilliantly. Then it didn't. What the men on boats like U-333 couldn't see was that the sea itself had grown ears. Those 20 seconds weren't a cloak of invisibility. They were a flare burning in the night. Air appears overhead within minutes of sending a message. Escorts turn and point as if the ocean were telling them exactly where to look. Depth charges fall so quickly after a transmission that it feels personal. In crew messes ashore, sailors trade stories that all sound the same. We kept it under 20 seconds. They showed up anyway. They knew exactly where to point. They were waiting for us. The conviction that once kept these crews alive starts leaking away like a bad seal. In May of 1943 alone, roughly 40 U-boats sink, nearly a quarter of all German submarines at sea that month. The hunters become the hunted. The pivot isn't a torpedo or a bigger bomb. It's a receiver, 4 metal sticks stuck in the wind, and a green circle of light that tells someone which direction to point. On England's northeast coast, the wind off the North Sea makes everything feel colder than it should. Inside a low building that looks like a school from the outside, the Royal Navy has transformed ordinary rooms into ears, listening across the ocean. This is a Y station, one of many. Young women in cardigans wear headsets, holding mugs of tea between their fingers, while grease pencils tap rhythmically on log sheets. One of them is Muriel Davison. She's 20 years old, quick with a screwdriver, and assigned to keep the listening alive. Her official title is radio mechanic. A net activates a scheduled window when German boats report their weather and position. Transmissions come like the wings of moths, brief, easy to miss, never on any predictable schedule. 15 seconds here, 20 seconds there. Muriel's workbench is a complete mess of valves, spare coils, and a battered ohmmeter. In the next room, an operator frowns and taps the side of a receiver that's slowly drifting off tune. A knob creeps incrementally. A capacitor heats unevenly. The entire operation falls apart. Muriel. She's already moving, swapping out a valve, re-zeroing the dial, checking the antenna feed, then thumping the chassis once with the heel of her hand, because sometimes metal responds to a little persuasion. A scratch appears in the headphones. The operator's pencil hovers, ready. An ellipse opens on the oscilloscope, like a cat's eye opening in darkness. She reads the bearing, and it leaves the room as nothing but a number and a direction. A minute later, it becomes a line on a chart sitting on a destroyer's table. A minute after that, it becomes a turn of a wheel. The old direction-finding method used a single rotating loop antenna that operators had to manually turn to find the null point. That process took time, long enough that a 20-second German transmission would be finished and gone before an operator could get an accurate bearing. The Allied system, built on an adcock array with 4 vertical antennas wired together to cancel interference from ground reflections, doesn't need to rotate at all. When the signal hits, the difference between the antenna pairs shows up immediately on a cathode ray tube as an ellipse. The long axis of that ellipse points directly to the source. An experienced operator can read it in a single breath. 2 ships getting readings means a cross. 3 ships means a triangle. A triangle gives you a patch of ocean to send an aeroplane to hunt. Muriel thinks about whether the trace on her screen is clean, whether the room next door is getting a steady, reliable beat, whether the handful of seconds where the entire net becomes vulnerable might matter. One bad solder joint could make the difference between catching a signal and missing it entirely. She thinks about friends lost at sea. Scarborough's Y station sits not far from the memorial for the Aguila Wrens, 19 young women who died when their transport was torpedoed. The grief lives in these walls. While this shore network grows denser, dozens of stations spread from Iceland to Gibraltar, from Canada to the Caribbean, the sea itself begins listening too. High-frequency direction-finding sets, the same core technology packed into shipboard equipment, go onto escorts, corvettes, and destroyer escorts. Before this change, a convoy could only radio ashore and wait for bearings to come back down the wire hours later. Now, the bearings bloom right there in the escort's Combat Information Center. The gap between sending a message and getting a response collapses from hours down to minutes, sometimes from minutes down to single digits. A convoy of 50 ships strings across 10 miles of ocean. In late 1942, U-boats still mount pack attacks and escape successfully. By 1943, everything changes. Diversion officers take bearings from the nets and draw moving patterns on massive wall maps. They reroute more than 100 convoys around wolf packs, with several dozen convoys partially avoiding attacks. Fewer wakes burn with oil, fewer names are carved into memorial stone. When a pack finds a convoy anyway and a boat radios in to guide the others, that radio line becomes a trail of breadcrumbs that escorts can follow right back to the source. Karl Donitz's headquarters outside Paris keeps tight control for a reason. Coordination was what made the wolf packs deadly. Orders go out to keep messages brief, to limit unnecessary chatter, to use the short signal code exclusively. Boat captains follow the doctrine because it worked brilliantly for 3 hard years. What they fail to see is that the very thing making their system work, the radio itself, has become the leash by which escorts pull them to the surface. On one side, rolled up sleeves, a slipped coil replaced in seconds, a bearing shouted to the next room, an aircraft launched within minutes. On the other, a steel cylinder containing 48 men running on batteries that drain faster if they try to outrun sound, breathing stale oxygen that runs out if they hide too long. A skipper forced to choose when to talk if he wants to survive the mission, when to stay silent if he wants to survive the day. Under those conditions, the phrase 20 seconds is safe sounds like mercy and comfort, but it isn't. The doctrine that said short signals are safe turns into something else entirely. Yet it's not a simple victory, with clear winners and losers. The women in Muriel's building are exhausted. The airmen launching from those short decks fly into weather that destroys machines. The escorts are grey steel and rust with coffee that's gone cold. What keeps the entire chain functioning is competence stacked on competence. People who know their jobs and do them fast enough to beat the other side's seconds. May 1943 arrives like any other month on the wall calendar at a U-boat base. Pinned photos, a coffee stain, a map dotted with pins. By the end of it, the pins mean something different. In the officers' mess at Lorient, men speak more softly than before. Cremer, back between patrols, listens to the accounts stacking up. We sent the contact report, and within 40 minutes, 3 destroyers were over the horizon. We dove, waited, surfaced to send a situation report, aircraft in 20 minutes. Course changes came next, twice over, but they held us for 8 hours. 41 U-boats lost in May. About a quarter of the operational boats that went out that month do not come back. The previous worst month had been less than half that. The exchange ratio shifts from one U-boat sinking roughly 100,000 tons of shipping down to just 10,000 tons per boat, then lower still, empty bunks, crew lists with lines drawn through names. HF-DF catches the direction of radio transmissions. Centimetric radar finds surfaced boats at night. Sonar holds them once they dive. Aircraft with depth charges and acoustic homing torpedoes keep pressure on. Hunter-killer groups combine small carriers with destroyer escorts. HF-DF accounts for about a quarter of U-boat sinkings, either directly or by queuing. Late one night, Cremer's boat shadows a convoy in foul weather, the kind of Cape Race soup that usually hides periscopes. He sends the brief report: position, course, speed. He keeps it under 20 seconds. Within minutes, the convoy's outer escorts start to swing toward him as if pulled. The weather that was supposed to be his shield becomes a blindfold. Deep, he orders. U-333 slides down. For hours they feel for safety in the beat of propellers, counting seconds between pings. Every time he thinks he has slipped the net, another pattern falls or an aircraft's engines skate across the hull. Crews speak of the ocean is wired. So many stations ashore, so many shipboard sets afloat, that a single burst can ring more than one bell. Plotters in London and Washington turn those bells into lines and those lines into safer corridors for merchants. More than 100 convoys are steered away from the wolf packs before the packs even smell them. The men in the packs wait and the convoy never comes. Dönitz tightens his orders. Radio silence where possible. Rendezvous without emissions. But packs need radio. Headquarters needs regular positions to manage fuel and weapons. Weather services need data for the Reich's pilots. The men at sea have less room to maneuver than the orders suggest. 20 seconds is safe, yet they turn toward us the moment we speak. A dive should be sanctuary, yet they hold us for hours. The ocean sprawls too vast for precision, yet an aircraft appears as if the sky itself had ears. Out of roughly 30,000 men who wear the U-boat badge during the war, about 28,000 die. That is nearly 9 in 10. By late 1943, for too many crews, survival becomes something salted with discipline and luck. Muriel's station goes on rotation, watch after watch after watch. WRNS fill out logbooks until their hands cramp. Bearings go to the Operational Intelligence Centre in London and to Naval Headquarters in Halifax, and from there to the sea. On cork boards, the thin threads of red yarn that mark sub-sightings begin to look less like hunting paths and more like a net. The women who keep the equipment alive rarely see what happens next. A line leaves the room and vanishes into the war. Every line has a shape, and the shape is getting sharper. The BBU memo says, keep it brief. A Y station log shows a bearing taken in under 10 seconds. A destroyer's helm turns seconds later. The flight deck of an escort carrier is a narrow place even on a good day. USS Croatan's crew calls the ship the Croat, and there's affection in the name because the margins are thin. The wind over the bow is the runway. The ocean is always trying to take it back. In the Combat Information Centre, a cramped room half buried in the ship, the watch lives by bearings and breathing. A line comes over wireless from a destroyer escort, a bearing just south of due west. A junior officer notes it, a new one, a tight bearing. He draws the line across the overlay and taps the air group's ready deck. Werner Henke has fought long enough to respect odds. U-515 is a good boat with a good crew, and the Atlantic has taught them both to be stubborn. Late in April 1944, the weather cuts visibility to a smear. Henke orders a transmission as short as he can make it, having learned the new rule, brief or die. The boat submerges before the word transmitted has fully left the radioman's lips. Minutes later, a lookout on a destroyer escort calls in what his radar already knew: aircraft have launched. Avengers lift and fan out, their radar scanning for a periscope or a conning tower that ducked too late. When they lose the scent, destroyer escorts fill the space with sound. ASDIC pings bloom into contacts, vague at first, then firmer. The officer on the stack says it, hold him. Every time the U-boat tries a sprint, the battery drains closer to dead. When it slows, the circle shrinks around it, weapons blossom in foam, and the hull breathes in and out under pressure. Henke makes the choices all skippers make when the ocean turns against them. He changes course by small increments. shifts depth to lose the ping's angle, and calls for silent running. A boat full of men becomes quiet as midnight, the loudest sound a drop of condensation hitting the deck. He thinks about waiting out the planes while they think about cycling, fuel and courage until the clock runs out. A single sonobuoy starts to speak in beeps and static. The aircrew set a pattern and fall down the steps of it. Left, centre, right, again, again. An Avengers crewman looks down and sees an oil smear blooming slow as a bruise. Maybe it's from a leaky valve, maybe from a near miss, maybe from nothing but fear. It doesn't matter, it is a line to follow. His pilot lines up for another pass, and depth charges drop like barrels. A geyser rises, and then the waiting comes again. More than an hour passes in waves of tension. An escort's crew passes coffee forward in chipped mugs, while a man with headphones says contact fading, and someone else marks that and moves the scale. From the first bearing to the first aircraft overhead can happen in under 10 minutes if the wind and deck play nice. A determined group can hold a single submarine under pressure for many hours without running out of tools. If a U-boat surfaces, centimetric radar sees it at night. If it ducks too long, a pilot with a trained eye will find the track. When the water boils, the weapons have multiplied since the early years of the war. Standard depth charges joined by acoustic homing torpedoes that listen for the boat's props and follow them. Henke's record shows him as brave, savvy and relentless. U-515 had bloodied noses before this day. What breaks them is not a single weapon. It's the orchestra. HF, DF, Q to get the first line on the chart, radar to find, sonar to hold, aircraft to reach, destroyers to finish, and a doctrine that keeps them all in tempo. The boat leaks, lurches, and loses the ability to wait the day out. Men come up into cold air and surrender, because surrender is the only choice left. A few days later, the Croatan group kills U-488, a supply submarine west of Cape Verde. Packs far from friendly ports need fuel and torpedoes at sea. Sink the cow and the pack goes hungry. HF-DF draws the arrow that points the men with bombs into the right square of the grid. The rest is craft and nerve. In CIC that night, an HF-DF operator leans back only when he knows the birds are back aboard and the screen has calmed to a hum. He is part of a chain that makes other people's work possible. If you asked him what he did that day, he'd say, "I read bearings." If you asked Henke's survivors what happened, they'd say, "They found us in minutes and never let go." Both are true. In the Croatan's log, the entry beside a successful launch is as short as the signal that started it. A time, a bearing, a direction. Below it sits a penciled note, reading simply, "Avengers away." No more than that. By late 1944, the war inside a U-boat sounds different. The most important noises aren't enemy engines or the pings that travel through your teeth. They are the small domestic sounds you can't stop hearing once you're afraid of them. The fan that stutters. The drip that grows into a tick. Herbert Werner is a young officer listening to men who breathe a fraction too fast because the air tastes wrong, counting minutes to the next surface on one more patrol. The skipper has a simple choice. Surface and charge batteries under a sky where centimetric radar can see a periscope feather at night, or stay deep and quiet until quiet turns into suffocation. Someone says, "We'll make a short signal, then come up," and everyone nods, even though the words sit poorly now. They all remember stories of aircraft overhead within minutes after a burst, of escorts changing course as if radios made ripples in the water. Yet the order goes out anyway. The radioman's hands are steady. His message leaves, small and perfect. They wait. The engineer stares at the battery board, where chalk marks carve down the hours, while a man in the bow wipes condensation off a valve and thinks about home. A hull holds only so much attention. When the boat has been under too long, you can hear men's bodies become part of the machine. Clothes rasping, a boot tapping. Up through dark water, the skipper blows the tanks, and the boat rises until it ebbs to blue. A lookout cranes up into the night and sees nothing but the kind of nothing that hides everything. When an aircraft appears, the skipper shouts to dive again, with no drama in the order, only the tone of a man crossing off a line on a list. Across the ocean, in the early summer of 1944, a different end plays out. U-505, commanded by Harold Lang, is forced to the surface by relentless pressure from an American hunter-killer group. Damage control spirals and scuttling charges are set. Ensign Albert David leads a boarding party in a launch that looks impossibly small against the Atlantic, climbing a wet, hostile hull while guns still bark. They throw charges overboard, close valves, and pull codebooks and machinery from a boat the Germans meant to drown. A captured submarine sits in the water. The Allies tow a prize. In the final year of war, from mid-1944 through May of 1945, German submarines sink roughly 150 merchant ships. In that same stretch, almost 200 U-boats are destroyed. Across the entire war, of the roughly 1,200 boats Germany built, around 800 are lost, with several hundred scuttled by their own crews at the end under coded orders. The casualty rate for submariners reaches nearly 9 out of every 10 men. Germany tries to fix the physics with a late-war miracle, the Type XXI, a streamlined boat designed to live underwater and hunt on batteries. It is brilliant in theory and impressive in the few steel examples that sail, but also too late. Allied production and training have already built a wall around the Atlantic, and the Allied way of finding, ears that live ashore and afloat, radar that writes on the dark, sonar that draws lines through salt, does not vanish because a single design is clever. The best crews in the world cannot outthink an opponent's ability to see them faster than they can hide. Werner writes about counting and sweating and waiting and the sensation that the ocean has become smaller. He notes the odd moments when the old rules still work and the longer runs where they don't. The instant dread that follows a necessary transmission haunts him, as if the message itself had weight and would pull predators in behind it. Relief comes too, because some men do live through this. Survival proves that skill and discipline still count, yet it also proves that luck sometimes smiles even when math frowns. Open a Bichon-Dieu circular that says, with confidence, transmit only briefly, and lay it beside a Y-station log that notes, bearing taken in seconds, and then put those next to an escort's night order book with the line, Avengers away. 3 documents that don't speak to one another, placed in sequence. A radio man braces, breathes, and taps out a message in under 20 seconds. On a ship not far enough away, an ellipse opens on a screen, a bearing is called, and a pencil cuts a line that has consequences. During the middle years of the war, the Allies learned to hear what the Germans sent. Once you can hear, you can find. Once you can find, you can choose.